Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for another session at ICFJ's Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. I'm David Maas, the manager of IJNet.org, a project of ICFJ's that provides tips, tools, and resources for journalists working all around the world. I'm thrilled today to be joined by three experts in media sustainability. Our first guest is Janine Warner. She's an ICFJ Knight Fellow and the co-founder of SembraMedia, a nonprofit organization that provides business and technical training, market intelligence, networking opportunities, consulting, and financial support to digital media entrepreneurs in Latin America, Spain, and the US. Also with us is Lissa Cupp. Lissa is a marketing strategy consultant working with tech and media companies to drive audience and revenue. She's also served as a coach and speaker in several Facebook Accelerator programs internationally. Finally, we have Nasr Hadi. He's also an ICFJ Knight Fellow and the co-founder of PROTO, a media development startup in South Asia that's building learning, research, and community programs for newsrooms. Our experts are joining us today for what we hope will be an engaging discussion on media sustainability, which is top of mind for many journalists during this pandemic. Now, before we begin, a few quick points. If you're a journalist on Facebook and haven't yet signed up for our Facebook forum group, please do so. You can search for ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. If you're not on Facebook, we do have a mailing list you can sign up for, and you can receive updates for upcoming webinars. Go to ICFJ.org, scroll down, and click on the Covering the COVID-19 Pandemic page. We've also got another great round of sessions next week. Award-winning investigative reporter Julian Scher is giving an online training on interviewing techniques and how to ask the hard questions you need to be asking during this crisis. We also have a special lessons learned session where we'll be hosting Linda Liu, a reporter with the South China Morning Post. She'll be joining us from Hong Kong. After this webinar, for the first time, we'll also be offering a special interactive session with our three experts today. On Monday, May 18th, Janine, Nasr, and Lissa will all be available to tackle your specific challenges and questions on media sustainability. After today's webinar, we'll send out a special invitation to this exclusive video chat. The first 40 people to sign up will be invited to register and speak directly with our experts. Finally, we want to hear from you. This morning, we launched a survey in partnership with the Tao Center to better understand how COVID-19 is changing journalism. You can visit ICFJ.org or our social media to take part. During our session today, please feel free to type in your questions to our experts in the Zoom chat, which you can open by clicking the chat option at the bottom of your screens. If you're watching from Facebook Live, type them in the comments below the video, and we'll make sure they get to the Zoom chat. And now, let me set the table a bit for today's session. Pre-COVID-19, the state of the news industry was already precarious. Revenues were down and newspapers were folding. Across the world, news deserts have become only more commonplace. The global health crisis has only made these issues worse. While news consumption has increased during the pandemic, the revenue hasn't followed. News outlets have laid off staff, they've furloughed workers, and they've cut salaries. A Guardian article last month warned of an extinction-level crisis for US newspapers. The situation is just as critical elsewhere in the world. Still, there are some bright spots. Newsrooms are adapting and they're innovating, and we're seeing new sources of funding crop up. I'll be talking with our guests today about what developments they're seeing emerge during this COVID-19 era. First off, thanks so much for joining us today, Janine, Lissa, and Nasr. I'd like to begin by posing a general question to all three of you. In the midst of this pandemic, what innovation are you seeing emerge from media outlets? And Janine, we can start with you.
Oh, I love this question. One of my favorite things in the world is to study innovation and new ideas and share them with other people. So I'll just start with two quick ones I've seen recently. One of them is a little site in Paraguay. I was doing a webinar with a bunch of media sites in Paraguay comparing ideas and strategies and being mutually supportive in a way that I think is so key right now. And one of them said, actually, our revenue's gone up. And everybody on the call went, wait, what? And he said, well, we started this daily update in WhatsApp about what you should know about the virus, what the rules are, what you can do, what you can't do. We send out every day to WhatsApp. And it seems that the daily newspaper down the street really isn't covering this that well. So advertisers started coming to us and asking if they could advertise in our WhatsApp group. So now we have little ads in our WhatsApp group. And I said, that's awesome. Do you make it easy for them to find you? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, in your own WhatsApp group at the end of each post, you say, hey, if you want to sponsor, come here. He said, oh, that's a good idea. So some of these little sites that we work with, but they're still learning some of the basics of advertising, are actually getting new advertising. And I want to really acknowledge a lot of the big traditional media advertising is just cratering. But that one really stood out because of that. And I'll share one other example that really touched my heart. Some of you might have heard that in Guayaquil, Ecuador, the coronavirus has been particularly damaging. There have been a lot of people who've died. There were stories about bodies piling up in the street. That was a little bit of an exaggeration, but it really was true for a while, and a really complicated place to work and live in all of this. And one of the websites we work with there that I really admire is called GK. It's Heca in Spanish. Kind of playing with Guayaquil as the name. And they created a memorial site, and a site where they're really honoring all the people who have passed, and the fact that people can't go to funerals with each other and things like that. So I think from daily updates and news you can use to really acknowledging the pain and suffering that's happening and think about how to better serve your audience, I would say those are two examples of innovation that I've seen that really impressed me. Lisa, I'm sure you have some other ideas on this.
Yeah, and those are great. I've seen, I've been working over the last year with some of the Canada organizations as part of the Facebook Accelerator, and I've really seen a lot of innovation there, sparked by need, right? I mean, when you absolutely must innovate. And one that comes to mind is the discourse created. You know, small businesses have been so affected by not only we're dealing with the pandemic, but the economic fallout of all these shutdowns that are happening. And they worked with other publishers to create a site called savesmallbusiness.ca. And it became a crowdsourcing place where businesses could list how they'd been affected, maybe how many employees were let go, and put some comments. And it became a source for story ideas, but also a place where they could update one another and driving subscribers as well. And so I think being at the forefront of it is a common theme that I've seen throughout. Publishers really standing up and saying, how can I get involved? How can I be present? How can I be out there and visible? The other one that I saw in terms of innovation, another publisher in Canada, Lissa really connected with contributors, and they were in a very tough spot and asking for help and asking for contribution, and it drove not only new subscribers, but it drove loyalty. And so they saw a 39% increase in loyal readers and a 14% increase in brand lovers from their efforts.
That's super interesting. And actually, I mean, we will be profiling that newsroom on IJNet later this week. Thanks for bringing that up, Lisa. And Nasr, what are you seeing in South Asia, the region you're working in?
So we've been looking at how people are trying to respond to this along 3 dimensions: commercial, technical, and editorial. Because innovating in any of those areas is very different from everything else. Specifically, one leading newspaper, perhaps one of the more credible brands, called the New Express, like all the other newspapers out here, their distribution was affected very severely for a while due to the lockdown, because newspapers, hawkers essentially went down the streets. And one of the things that they realized, and we're a weirder market when it comes to this, that some of their more loyal readers prefer the e-paper version, the electronic version of the print product, over the digital product. And so what they started doing, and this isn't groundbreaking technology, but it's just finding a small hack that's technical that ensures that they're still able to get their product out to the people that want it. They started looking for, they have a bot that looks for online mentions of their brand or for one of their journalists or staff. And whenever it comes up, they send out a tweet just saying a brief hi that's not very intrusive, pointing people to their electronic paper product. One of the other things that the same brand is doing, which I haven't seen enough people do, is the senior most people in the organization, of course, are influencers. And at a time when you have advertising revenues dipping, or traffic spiking more around COVID-related content and not necessarily around the more general news, especially with larger legacy products that are more horizontal in nature. They've started to use everyone from the promoter down, but especially the promoter, which is very rare, doing very newsletter digest style posts on their own social media, which has much larger audiences, or at least much more influential audiences. It's like a daily recap at the top of the day doing, hey, here's the major headlines from our news product this week. I've rarely seen owners of organizations doing something, large legacy organizations doing something like this. In terms of editorial innovation, the entire legacy media world is very different from the independent digital media practitioners and startups, right? The challenges they face are very different, but also in terms of how they're pivoting what they're doing. Two things that stand out: an independent journalist, and I'm sure we have many examples of this, but this one's particularly compelling here in India. An independent data journalist that started a SoundCloud podcast, which is just a 5-minute capsule every day in the evening when you're winding down on what they're seeing or analyzing around how the policymakers are responding to the COVID crisis. It's small, short, very to the point, and very efficient in its usage of time. We haven't seen a lot of journalists. I mean, you see podcasts in general, which are more episodic and serial in nature. But we haven't seen this kind of packaging from practitioners before, especially individuals, not just organizations. And one startup which does good news primarily, called the Better India, they've looked at how they repackage what they already do for a more distinct audience, a more specific audience that they think is more monetizable. And what they've done is they do good news throughout. They've launched a product called the Better India for Kids. And what they're doing is they're targeting parents saying, hey, your kids are now not going to school. Online learning depends on how they're responding to all of this. Part of addressing that frustration of yours could be helped by this daily dose of positive, optimistic news in these depressing times. And all of these are different examples of how people are trying to hack around what we're seeing right now. It's still early days. We'll still keep an eye out for something that's much more path-breaking.
Interesting. And so you all three point to, different innovations that newsrooms are taking on. How important is it alongside this that newsrooms diversify their revenue sources? And are you seeing new developments on this end? And Lissa, I'll direct this your way to start.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, traditionally, news organizations have relied so heavily on the ad model. And of course, a lot of it has been eroded. But driving subscriptions is an area, and paid subscriptions has been successful for many. And I know that it's been a challenge for some as well. But including a donor model, we've seen success, many publishers doing this. And one thing I found is that a lot of publishers will think, well, if I charge for subscriptions, I can't ask for donations. I have to do one or the other. I'm either a donor model or a subscription model. And what we found is some publishers are successful at both. And so they'll have support journalism. You put it in a prominent place on the top nav, in article, at the end of an article. Particularly with COVID, we've seen this even a lot more. Now more than ever, we're bringing you the news, and obviously readership is up. And so we've seen that very successful. So if you're a publisher and you don't have a donor model, I think you're leaving money on the table. But there are other, I think there are other opportunities to still grow ad revenue right now. As advertisers, certainly have the ad teams talk with the advertisers and say, what are you doing with your brand to step up and be a leader right now during this crisis? We can help put you in front of our readers while they're looking for news, and they need reassurance from the brands that they trust. And this is an opportunity for you. So I think it's an opportunity to knock on those advertisers' doors again with ideas. There's some great brands out there doing it, you know, Marriott and Uber and all those, Dove soap, who are just out there in the forefront saying, we're here for you. And they're not shying away, but they're tailoring their message around COVID.
Interesting. And Janine, are you, and you know, the outlets you're familiar with, how important is it for them to diversify their revenue? And are you seeing developments there?
Well, we have been working with what we call independent digital media. These are, we don't call them startups because some of them are 20 years old, but they're digital natives. So they tend to be starting small and growing from there. And we've been pushing diversified revenue from the start because most of these are started by journalists who got frustrated by the censorship and the limitations of traditional media that you find in many Latin American countries and went and started their own news sites. And so we say, hey, you need to diversify your revenue because that's the key to independence. If you're not overly dependent on any one revenue source, it's a lot easier to keep your independence. And if somebody does say, hey, if you write that story, we're going to cut the money, or if you don't write that story, we're going to cut the money, you can say, you know what, that's okay. We have lots of other sources. That's one of the reasons that, like Lissa, we're really fans of membership models. Lots of little donors are better than a couple of big ones. But I think we're really seeing now that diversified revenue is also the key to sustainability in times of crisis. That the more different sources of revenue you have and the more different ways you're making money, the better. Now, I always try to kind of put that in context. In our research with hundreds and hundreds of media sites over the last, 5-10 years, depending on when I start my research chart, you see that there are literally dozens of ways they make money. And maybe you can categorize them into 10 macro categories. Advertising, but there are a whole bunch of different kinds of advertising. Reader-driven revenue, but there are whole, donations, subscriptions, crowdfunding. There are a number of different ways to do that. And then you find things like consulting services, agencies. A lot of small media organizations create an agency, and some of the bigger ones have done this in recent years as well, so they can provide additional services that aren't just advertising, but might be creating content for other people's websites, things like that. So I think the challenge now is not to start a whole lot of new media ways to make money. This is a really challenging time to start new things from scratch. And I've always said it's tough to do 12 things at once. Pick a couple that work. But in your own media organization, think about what are the ways that we've been making money in the past that showed some potential. If it's membership, maybe you want to really push that because readership is up. If it's services for clients, you may just need to adapt those a little bit. So maybe instead of promoting that hotels are, a great place to stay this week because most people aren't traveling, look at some of the innovative ways that hotels have been talking about the future of travel and virtual tours. And maybe you can get a hotel to sponsor a virtual tour of your local museum. So think about what are the kinds of things you can do that build on the strength you already have, build on the relationships you already have, and understand the context that things have changed, but not shut it down. And I'll just share, Lissa, you probably saw this too in Canada. One of the most interesting kind of combinations of advertising and subscription I saw was a big advertiser, a fast food restaurant in Canada, that sponsored a whole lot of daily newspapers so they could take their paywall down and not require subscriptions for their news. And I thought, wow, this is a time to double down on advertising, to ask your advertisers to give you even more, to do something dramatic, like really stand out from the crowd by making your content available to everybody, even if they don't subscribe. And I'm guessing that fast food restaurant got a lot of takeout orders, which is one of the few things you can do. So think about who are your advertisers that are still serving people, who are your clients and what kinds of new services they need, and think about being agile, but not necessarily starting something completely new when we're all overloaded and overworked in this industry at this time. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks. Yes, no, definitely helpful. And you both bring up advertising, which is where I wanted to segue into next. And Nasr, I want to bring you in for this. Certainly there have been shifts in the advertising space during this crisis. And what are you seeing, and do you have advice for how news outlets should respond?
So I'll make a couple of points each in both advertising and reader revenue. One of the conundrums right now that we're seeing with media organizations is there is a spike in viewership or readership because it's a crisis. Everyone wants the news about the crisis. TV, for instance, is seeing up to 300% spikes in viewership. Digital traffic is seeing what we're calling a COVID bump, which might not necessarily last. But the challenge here is how monetizable is that market, right? And the problem that we're facing right now is advertisers, because in a crisis, ad and marketing budgets are the first to get axed. That's one. Their capacity, of course, is reduced. The other part also is brand safety. By default, they've usually shied away from associating with content around conflicts, crises, etc. Right? And in a world where a lot of digital advertising revenue is through programmatic ad networks, that's as simple as them defining keyword filters. And so if you're a publisher, one of the things that you're faced with is more of your content inventory right now is COVID related. And that's the part that publishers are filtering out, ad networks are essentially filtering out as eligible real estate for a lot of mainstream advertisers. And so in this case, as I will mention later with reader revenue too, publishers that have been operating in very specific niches and have invested in building direct relationships with advertisers are seeing better responses because primarily they're able to go in for time-bound blanket sponsorship across a bunch of digital real estate on their site. We saw this for a while, way before this crisis. Washington Post did this with their Lily newsletter and website, which is vertical focus specifically on gender issues. And they had it blanket supported by JP Morgan Chase. Those are the kind of first-party blanket advertising relationships that are still working, but I'm seeing it only with niche publishers. We're seeing a similar analogy also working primarily for reader revenue. Publishers that have invested in making asks from the readers, treated them as a community where they've constantly demanded participation. They're able to still make an ask for users to participate in new forms of new editorial formats or new things that they're trying out right now. Those are also the ones that translate into one of the two types of reader revenue, right? We make clear buckets of two types: donations, distinguished from payments. The donations are primarily given by people that are passionate about our position on things, viewership, views on things, and orientation. And we see a lot of publishers, specifically in India, like The Wire, Stroll, etc., that have constantly been asking and demanding participation from their users. Still see that sustained through the crisis, possibly even see a small bump. Reader revenue, when translated in payments, in terms of payments though, that's when people are paying for what we usually say is a utility, the way we pay for stuff that, electricity, gas, etc. Right? I see a compelling enough reason to pay for your product. We're now starting to treat Netflix like a utility, most of us. I think news products that meet that standard right now are few and far in between. There's a very few more and very expectedly in business news in India. And those are the ones that are case studies right now for any kind of payment reader revenue, which we refer to as subscriptions. But we still think it's not a holy grail. Rajana Resetti says this very well. Treat it as a mixed basket of revenues. It's an entire pivot either to reader revenue or purely to advertising. Both of them are equally
Great, thanks Nasr. And actually, I want to start bringing in some questions that we're getting from our viewers. And we have one from Samuel Okocha, who says he and a partner, they bought a domain name to start up a travel news website back in January. And he wants to know, what's your take on launching a new online startup during this pandemic? And so I will throw that out there. I don't know, Janine, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, first of all, I'm here to inspire entrepreneurs to create new sites, and I always want to entertain new ideas and help people think about how they can fulfill them. I will say there's a double-edged sword to starting any new business during a financial crisis. If you pull it off, you have a really good chance of surviving when things get better. But it's obviously a very difficult time to start something and actually look for revenue. If you're in the financial situation that you can afford to spend some time investing in content, building your brand, starting to build an audience right now, and you don't have to rely on the revenue from that immediately to feed your family, it might be an interesting time to do that. Most of the digital media startups that we work with, in the first 6 months or a year, it can be very hard to monetize at all. And if you do, it's usually one of those side hustles like consulting services or training services or something that the journalist can do to make some money and then afford to be able to do their media. Now, the category of travel, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, is a particularly challenging one right now, since travel is pretty much shut down around the world. So I think if that's your vision, I want to do a travel site, you need to think about being especially innovative right now. And it may be that if you find ways to stand out from the crowd, when we do go back to traveling, and we all want to believe we will get to do that sometime in the future, you may have an audience. So people are doing virtual tours, people are doing virtual travel. My stepmother participated in a tour of Notre Dame last week, in which 800 people got on a call to do a tour of Notre Dame with a very well-respected tour guide. And, you know, it's getting a lot of attention right now. If you can think of ways to translate travel into the virtual world, that might work. And I would apply this to any niche news site out there. It could be sports, and you're thinking about how do we do some kind of a new sports challenge, or get people to compete with each other from home because they can't watch football online right now. What can you do in this environment that helps your audience have an experience similar to what they crave, and maybe even help make up for some of the things that they're missing in the real world? But I would say travel is a particularly challenging niche, and any economic crisis is a tough time to start a media site. So just be sensitive. Do you have the personal reserves? Which I think is a question every entrepreneur has to ask. Can I keep feeding my family while I do this? And some journalists right now who've been laid off unexpectedly are going straight to, I'm going to start my own news site. And that may be a way to start making a little money right away. But be aware that most news sites don't make money immediately unless the people who start them already have some consulting or training or other kind of revenue coming in. Good question, though.
That's great. Thanks, Janine. So I want to ask a question about events. I know a lot of local news outlets, they've relied on events in the past, you know, as a source of revenue. But of course, with the physical distancing going on, these have taken a hit as well. Lissa, are you saying newsrooms getting creative on this end at all?
Yeah, actually, I've seen a ton with events, and I think there's a two-pronged benefit to them. One, obviously, a source of revenue, so you could have ticket sales, but I've also seen it drive membership or subscriptions by making them subscriber-only events. And then they don't actually pay for the ticket to the event, but they have to be a subscriber to be invited. And then they covet it. They really want to attend, and it drives loyalty. So we've seen a lot of success with that. I think people like, and the fact that you can't be in person right now is a bit of a challenge, but we've seen so many people get creative. And there are virtual events, as Janine mentioned, like tours, but also I've seen that play out in news outlets. People like behind the scenes as well. And so I think being creative with whatever is unique to your market and creating an event around it can drive revenue right now, and particularly loyalty, which will help you in the long run.
Got it. And Nasr, do you want to weigh in? Are you seeing different things in, you know, the region you're familiar with?
Events are kind of a heartbreaker in news revenue circles right now, because they were always pitched as do a mix of content, research, and events in whatever niche you're in. You'll be able to build attention and loyalty with one and then monetize with the other. But the thing is, in terms of ad revenue too, there were a lot of live events that used to be big revenue generators for organizations, and you don't. Most of them would stand cancelled, and possibly might remain cancelled for the rest of the year. The outlook on that is great, and so with events hosted in-house in a lot of these organizations, almost everyone is trying a webinar version of what they used to do, whether it was training events or just networking opportunities. A lot of them that had a price tag to these. As Lissa said earlier, we've seen a couple of them remove the price tag simply because an offline event is much more active participation. You need to be present. You're trying to engage with the people around you. Doing something online allows people to participate passively. And then if you put a price tag to it, the response to that is not going to be as great. The conversions aren't as great. I've seen a lot of publishers remove the price tag, but our suggestion to them has stayed, keep the price tag, but give people an option to bypass it. And that usually ends up being turn into a registered user when you weren't before, instead of having to pay us for this. And that seems to be working for some. I go back to my earlier point about wherever there was habit building and community building and participation building with publishers, those are seeing the best conversions and responses with any of this. And most of those were in niches, more general news, more horizontal products, not so much.
Nasr, David, can I jump in back?
Definitely.
Nasr brought up a point that I wanted to mention around events that I didn't, and Nasr, you reminded me of it. I've seen some success with people debate about, well, can I charge for events now because it's not live and now it's going to be virtual and maybe we'll make it free. And a lot of events are going that route. I've also seen success with pay what you can. So it's technically free, but it has a payment feature and you can choose your amount. And that's been successful with some. So that's an option. And then just the last thing I wanted to say about events is there is still a hunger for, I mean, when you look at companies like Live Nation that owns Ticketmaster and all these events that have gone away, and including travel, people are at home and it's getting a little bit old and they want good content and they want events, they're still fans, whether it's fans of a local art or fans of a concert they were going to see, or food. If they're still foodies, they're still foodies. So the opportunities to cook together. So really look for innovation. And this is an opportunity, and this will be our new normal for a little while. So I think there's still a ton of opportunity out there for events, for innovative publishers. And that you can charge, again, different models.
Just to add to what Lisa said, right? Again, the hesitation is primarily making something that used to be paid free. And while that might work for now, I think all of us are worried about how will we get it back to being paid again if we make it free for now. And that's something that different publishers are trying to solve in different ways. But I agree, there's a big hole created by the absolute cancellation of most live events across the industry. And so there's definitely a space to get innovative with. I know most of us are packaging these as webinars, but there's still differentiation and segmentation that can be built into these channels that we should definitely try out.
Got it. Yeah, thanks both. Those are great points. And I want to move on to another non-advertising source of revenue that we've seen crop up during this crisis, and that's the emergence of a number of emergency funds and grant opportunities to support journalists. And I'll bring in Janine to start with this. Is this a space that journalists and media entrepreneurs should continue to look to during this crisis?
So it's kind of amazing how much grant funding is out there right now and how much sort of emergency grant funding, from little tiny grants for freelancers, a few hundred to a few $1,000s to do a specific story, to multi-million-dollar funds from Google, Facebook, and others right now, really trying to help media survive this. So yes, of course, apply for those. If you think you have any chance at all, you should certainly apply. That said, I think it's always important to remember very few media sites really survive on grants alone. We've done research on more than 800 media sites in Latin America, and less than 20% of those have ever gotten any grants at all. So I think there's kind of a fallacy in some people's heads that all these little nonprofit and socially minded news sites live on grants. The reality is a very small percentage of them do, and they tend to be the ones that are the most focused on investigative journalism and fact checking, and they're the ones that win the awards at the Online News Association and the Gabo Festival and things like that. So if you're in that category, you have a great shot at getting some of this grant money. If you're doing a travel site, you're probably not going to qualify for most of the grant funding out there because it's really designed for that most important, vital source of news that people need to live and survive in this environment. But absolutely you should apply. I'll give a shout out, and Stella, Taylor, David, maybe one of you can put up the link to IJNet. If you're not already a subscriber of IJNet, and I do not work directly for them, but I highly recommend their newsletter, They put out a list in multiple languages of all of the grant opportunities. They break it down by country, by region. If you want to keep an eye out for where's the next one, and be aware, often those grants will be announced on May 1st and they're due by June 1st. And right now those deadlines are often even shorter. So you need to be watching for them. As soon as you see the opportunity, go see what's involved in filling out the form, follow the instructions to the letter. If you're filling out a form and it says you have 50 words to say your mission, don't try to use 75 words. It's really hard, but as journalists, you should be good at saying a lot concisely. If you've never written a grant before, you might be surprised that your writing skills and your storytelling skills are the key to successful grant writing, just like they're the key to journalism. And finally, I'll say personal relationships can really matter. So work your network. Try and figure out who might know somebody who works at the organization that could support you. If they ask for letters of recommendation, think about people that might be connected to people in that organization. Recommendations always mean more if they come from somebody I know than somebody I've never heard of. So look in your LinkedIn relationships, think about people you've met at conferences, and really reach out to those folks for support. That's just a few ideas, but yeah, the grant money is out there right now. But my final word of caution is don't expect it to be around forever. I think we're seeing a real push right now. I think moving forward in the next few years, if the stock markets don't come back around the world, expect grant money to go down, because most foundations survive on their own investments and only give away what they make on those investments. So it's a really key time if you're looking for those funds.
Great, thanks Janine, and we always appreciate a good IJNet plug. We are available in 7 languages, and next week we'll have French up, so an 8th language soon coming your way. We have another audience question from Brian in South Africa. He wants to know, this is more of an editorial question, and he's worried that COVID-19 news, with sources limited, this might end up being a little monotonous for followers and readers, and wants to know what the way forward is, perhaps diversifying your content. And Nasr, I can start with you.
Sure. I think one of the things we try and reiterate is there's no prescription that's a one size fits all. A lot of what will work for your audience depends very much on your specific context and audience mix. In general, I get this point about, especially with across general news sites, the end user seeing very less differentiation between what they're seeing day to day, everyone reporting the same headlines and statistics and so on. But what we have seen is, as long as you figure out something that is on brand for you, or some kind of an intersection between what's happening outside right now and what you have built a reputation doing over the past several months, years, however long your product's been out there, that specific intersection ends up being a niche. And you can figure out however deep you want to go within that. It is typically something that your general news products will stay away from. For instance, if you are a travel website, most international travel, of course, is stopped right now. I see Skift, which is in something that I refer to often as a global case study for outdoor verticals. They're a travel-only focused vertical website. They're doing a great job of figuring out COVID intersections with their specific niche and what they cover, and doing a range of combinations in terms of industry recommendations for small organizations, big businesses, recommendations on how to retain the relationships with passengers or tenants or hotel customers, etc., in their industry, despite the gap. Again, the focus here is going to be what is the vertical or niche that you operate in, and how does it intersect with the crisis that's going on right now.
Great.
I'd also like to comment that I saw Lissa put place in chat, especially with niches and non-news niches. The whole affiliate marketing model works very well, where you're able to find a way for people to transact through your publishing inventory with purchases of products and services that are related to your niche.
Great, thanks, Nasr. And another source of revenue that I think, depending on the region, has emerged is that in some instances, governments have stepped in to help newsrooms. But of course, this can be also a double-edged sword. And has this emerged in regions you're familiar with? Lissa, I'll bring you in for this. Is this something newsrooms should look toward? And if they do, what should they take into consideration?
I think I'm going to hand this one to Janine a little bit, not to put you on the spot, Janine, but I
Mm-hmm.
think if I recall, you had some good examples with this one.
Yeah, Janine, do you want to take this?
And I was just answering a question in chat because I didn't expect to be called on. I'm sorry. Just repeat the question.
Sorry, yeah.
I'm so sorry.
No, government support.
Sure. So
Sorry about that, Janine.
Yeah.
I just recalled that you would.
it's all good. I'm happy to answer this question. Thank you. I was just there's some great questions in chat.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm like, sorry.
No, government support in places like Britain, the BBC is a news site that I love, and I'm really glad it's partially supported by government. And I think Europe in particular right now is thinking, should we have a big global fund funded by governments to try and help support news? In the US, some local areas are starting to say, should we use local tax revenue to support the local daily newspaper? I think those are probably really good ideas. In many of the countries that we work in Latin America, and I know in many other countries around the world, government support becomes much more complicated. So if you're in Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua, where the government is very restrictive about what media is allowed to do, and independent journalists often risk literally their lives and their freedom to do the kind of journalism they do, government money is probably not going to improve that situation. And in fact, the fact that government puts money into some of the media and not other media can be really problematic. And even in countries like Mexico that certainly on the surface have a much stronger freedom of press and a much bigger diversity of media organizations, in the country of Mexico, historically, the government has been the biggest advertiser in the country. And so while it's not as overt in that country as it is in some other countries, media sites that are heavily dependent on government revenue are also much less likely to critique the government and much more likely to publish all the press releases and things put out by the government. And we're not political. We never tell you who you should vote for, and we don't support media based on that. In fact, you can't be part of SembraMedia's directory and organization if you are funded only by a government or only by a political party. So we believe truly independent journalism has to be independent. And in that context, as somebody who lives in the United States and grew up here, I think government support of public radio and public television and maybe local newspapers could be a really important part of our future and balancing news deserts. And that could apply to many other countries. But anytime we talk about government supported media, I have to kind of say, yeah, but remember Cuba and Venezuela and other countries where government support doesn't always mean the same thing. So, thanks.
Great. Nasr, do you want to, I'll bring you in for this.
Yeah. I'll take a small detour answering this for media. In India, what we're seeing is every sector that can is making the case for a government waiver. Earlier today, I saw a piece by the local WeWork country head and a couple of other heads of a couple of other leading co-working spaces, making the case for how that sector was critical to the startups economy and bailout or waiver of some sort at this point would be important when we start heading towards a revival. To them, it translates to actions like rent waivers or taxation relief, etc. In media, what we've seen and asked for, and I haven't seen action from the government on this so far, but what we have seen and asked for is two things. In print, government ad revenues can go as high as 60% of total ad share. And so what we've seen publisher associations and broadcaster associations ask for is two very specific things. One is they've asked for the government to clear outstanding dues that run as far back as the past 10 years. That's a lot of bills. And I'm sure just them coming through is going to be a nudge up for these organizations. And the other thing that we've seen is for future bookings and existing bookings that were made before the crisis, but were due now. They've requested the government double the ad rates. And so instead of some kind of an external funding, they've made these two very specific asks. The third ask is not just specific to media in India, It's across sectors, the one I mentioned earlier, which is relief from various kind of service tax standards and withholding tax standards.
Great. And as we start winding down, we have time for about another question or two. And I want to throw one out there about the importance of loyalty and building loyalty. I know they're pre-COVID, there was a big emphasis on this. And I know it's important for subscriptions and memberships and donations, get your readers to want to buy into your news outlets. And how has this adjusted at all during the crisis? And how can newsrooms, approach this differently, given the times we're in? And I'll bring Lissa in for this.
Great. So I've seen a lot of success with this. One publisher, again, pulling from some of the Canada teams, I want to get that quote. They said they reawakened their relationship with their community. So they stepped up, they were the forefront. They put their names and faces out there, which we encourage anyway. Who are the people behind the words, right, that you're reading? The publisher was doing Zoom calls, showing what his family was cooking for dinner. They were playing Risk and other board games at night. So picture, you've got this Jimmy Fallon, US talk show host kind of thing going on, but very relatable and building loyalty. And as I mentioned earlier, like Le Soleil saw their loyalty numbers go up. So people really embracing their local news as a lifeline and supporting them and seeing this as an opportunity to get to know them, that these are the people in my community that are on the front line for me, that are bringing that news that I need to know what in the world's going on outside because we're all trapped at home. And who are those people? And we're seeing it pay off in increased subscription and increased loyalty.
Great, thanks, Lissa. And now that we are definitely winding down, I do want to end on a more optimistic note. So I'd just like to bring in all three of you, just some final remarks from each of you. Do you have words of advice for journalists and media entrepreneurs as they navigate what's the crisis we're in today? Nasr, can I start with you?
Sure. Two things that we've been talking about with partners, with other organizations that engage with us on a regular basis. The first part has been, don't start something that you won't be able to sustain once we're out of this. There's this temptation to, as we're trying to figure out how do we respond to this, to very quickly figure out something that will work now. But we might realize as we go along that this isn't something that it isn't the kind of activity that we keep going once life hopefully soon returns back to normal. Because then it's a wasted effort. I think it's important to take the time to figure out what is it that we could do that works within this crisis, but then we could keep going as we go along, right? So there's those relationships, both reader and advertiser or whatever other monetization way we're using, sustain themselves. The other part is staying back from associating with things that aren't on brand. Again, the temptation of starting something new or repackaging something that we already do. There's this temptation to very quickly associate with a social cause or a campaign of sorts that we think will resonate very well with the audience in this crisis. But just because it resonates with the audience in this crisis, that doesn't necessarily meet the check of does it resonate because it comes from you versus there's someone else out there that is more suited to bring this to their audience. So the brand disconnect and the ability to continue after the crisis, those are two filters that are very, very important. I'd also very quickly try to mention something that I intended to bring very early in the call. Keeping an eye out for commercial innovation case studies. I said earlier about innovation being technical or editorial, and we are seeing a lot of that as hacks or repackaging in new formats, categories, etc. But in terms of true commercial innovation, either in terms of pricing or something else, there is going to be few case studies and fall in between, and less so per market. In India, we've recently seen one case which has both raised eyebrows because it's not the norm, but has also generated a lot of curiosity. There seem to be case studies for it in the US, but not so much in India. A leading independent website called The Quint, looking for more capital to access and seeing traditional ways to access capital shut for it. Explored a bit of financial restructuring that has given it access to public market capital. It's complex to explain on the call itself, but I'd suggest that people who can and are interested look up the case study of how they've gone ahead and done that. Again, it's both raised eyebrows because it's not the norm, but it's interesting.
Awesome. Thanks, Nasr. Lissa, should we go to you now? Any words of advice, final words of advice for media entrepreneurs, journalists now?
Sure. A couple of things. And one, I can't stress enough, connect with your audience. Be out there, make it personal, names, faces, lead. So this is not the time to shy away. This is the time to be out there with what resources you have. And then the other point I want to add, and it actually came from that question from South Africa about COVID news being monotonous. This is going to be a long haul. This is something that hit us all of a sudden. And, you know, we all used to watch every update and watch the whole thing. And now we'll find that we're watching the update, but we're multitasking. Now, like we want to hear, or now we'll wait for Twitter, we'll wait for the highlights. So adapt as you coverage, and this is more, I don't usually speak to the journalism side of this, more the marketing side. However, I think staying relevant is really going to be key. And so aside from giving facts and, you know, how many illnesses or whatever in the region or whatever, but how are businesses adapting? I'm seeing a lot of success with, you know, the economic fallout of this, but people getting back to business, even if you're in the travel space. Sure, people aren't traveling, but everybody's trying to figure out, boy, I really want to take a vacation. What can I do? Can I get money back? Are planes flying? What's it like to fly right now? So keep that content current and evolving through what's probably going to be an 18 to 24 month window for this. And keep your readers sort of on the hook and relevant with the questions as they evolve with them.
Awesome. Thanks, Lissa. And Janine, I'll bring you in now.
Awesome. And I just saw somebody post, like, I still have questions. Can I email them directly? And I'm sure you can find us and we'll all try and answer them. But one of the things we're going to do, and I know David will talk more about it, are breakout sessions. So after this, you can sign up to be in more interactive sessions with Nasr, Lissa, or I, or all three of us. And I think all three of us are really excited to be able to answer your questions more directly. You'll actually be in a call with us and not just in the background limited to chat. So that's a new thing that they're experimenting with these webinars to try and make them more interactive. And I welcome you to come to that. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have in that discussion. I'll end with one of the favorite things that I've seen journalists do right now, and that is starting to partner with each other more. I think, you know, historically journalists are very competitive. We all struggled to get our story on the front page. We all wanted to win the Pulitzer Prize. But this is really a time to come together and not just to cover news better, but also funders like that. There's an example in the story that I posted in chat that two news sites in Cuba who realized that their teams were complementary. One of them did more with writing and illustration. The other did more with video and multimedia. They figured out that coming together, they could have their teams complement each other. They could have fewer journalists out on the street at risk in the first place. They could have better coverage for both sites. They came up with a very creative way about how they shared those stories and permission to change the headlines and the photos so they weren't exactly the same, but they served pretty different audiences with different focus. So even that wasn't a huge issue for them. And then one of them went to the funder, one of their funders, and said, hey, look what we're doing. I just wanted to kind of keep you in the loop. And the funder was like, wow, that's awesome. Can we give you more money? So people who do donations, people who do grants, love to see people work with each other and not in competition. If I'm donating money because I want the world to be a better place, if I'm a foundation trying to improve the media ecosystem of your area, I don't like it when two media sites fight over the limited resources. I like it when they use those resources to create more journalism better. So for all those reasons, we need each other more than ever. We can cover news better, safer, faster, in a more interesting way if we work together. And even the funders and the readers seem to like it, are all reasons to think about this is a time to come together and to forget the competition of the past. You can go back to trying to win your Pulitzer Prize next year, but this year, we're all trying to save lives with this. Our own, our audiences, our families. It's really a time to work together. So I'll leave you on that note, and the most inspiring thing I've seen is how many journalists are finding ways to work together.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Janine. That's a great note to end on. And thanks to all three of you for sharing your insights and your expertise with us today. And thanks to all our viewers who tuned in. Please be on the lookout for a survey that we will be sending out shortly after this webinar. We really value your feedback, and it's critical for us for these live events. And as I mentioned earlier, and as Janine recently just went into a bit more, we know we didn't get to all your questions. So we will be holding these special interactive sessions on Monday, May 18th. And we will send out an invitation link after this webinar to join this exclusive video chat. And the first 40 people to sign up will be able to join. So please be on the lookout for that. Finally, another reminder, we did launch a survey this morning in partnership with the Tao Center to better understand how COVID-19 is changing journalism. You can visit icfj.org or our social media to take part. And you can expect to see a full recording of this webinar on both ICFJ and IJNet's YouTube pages. And we'll also post a recap article on icfj.org and IJNet.org with key quotes and takeaways that you can use in your reporting. Again, thank you all for tuning in. Thanks to our speakers, and stay safe, and we'll be back soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Well done, David. Great.